The shelter smelled of bleach and old fear. Rowan Voss stood just inside the doorway, and he did not need his eyes to know the place had given up trying to be warm. The heating vent above him rattled every 90 seconds. He'd counted it 3 times already. An old habit from checkpoints in Helmand, where counting things kept a man's mind from wandering somewhere it shouldn't go. Somewhere with sand in it. Somewhere with a leash still coiled in his left hand and nothing at the other end of it. His cane found the seam where linoleum met concrete. 2 steps left. A trash can, judging by the faint tang of antiseptic wipes. He built the room the way he built every room now, not with light, but with edges. Sound, temperature. The way air moved differently around a steel cage versus an open kennel run. Somewhere down the corridor, a chain-link door groaned open, and 30 voices erupted at once, not barking, not really. Something closer to a chorus of small alarms, each dog announcing itself to a world that had stopped listening. Rowan's jaw tightened. He knew that sound. He had made that sound, in his own way, for the better part of a year after the blast shouting into rooms that had already emptied out. "You're early," said a voice to his right. A volunteer, young, the kind of cheerful that hadn't yet been worn down. "Most people don't come in till after lunch." "I'm not most people," Rowan said, and left it at that. He did not tell her that mornings were easier, that the shelter, before the after-school crowd arrived to coo over puppies, was quiet enough that he could hear a single dog 3 kennels down, refusing, not failing to make a sound at all. That was the one he'd come for. The volunteer walked him toward Kennel Row C, her sneakers squeaking on the wet floor, and Rowan let his left hand drift to the cane's grip, fingers curling around it, the way they used to curl around a leash. The knuckles went white. He didn't notice. He never did. Kennel C14 was silent in a way the others weren't. No pacing, no whining. Just the faint click of nails shifting weight. Once, and then stillness again. The stillness of an animal that had learned stillness was safer than hope. "That's Dagger," the volunteer said, dropping her voice the way people do near something they don't understand. "Belgian Malinois surrendered 8 weeks ago. He won't let anyone near the door. Not the vet techs, not animal control, especially not—" She hesitated, glancing at the badges-shaped patch still sewn, out of old habit, onto Rowan's jacket sleeve. "Especially not anyone in uniform, even close to one." Rowan's hand found the top rail of the kennel gate. Cold steel, worn smooth where hundreds of hands had gripped it before his. From inside, low and guttural, came a sound that needed no eyes to translate. A growl that started somewhere in the chest and never rose to a bark, a warning issued once, by something that had already decided barking was a promise it no longer intended to keep. Rowan didn't step back. "I know," he said quietly, to the dog, to the dark, to no one in particular. "I don't trust the ones who wear it either." The growl didn't stop, but it didn't get louder, and somewhere in that narrow, uncertain silence, 2 creatures who had both stopped believing anyone was still coming for them stood 3 feet apart, neither one willing to be the first to move. The growl held for 11 seconds. Rowan counted them the way he counted everything now, not out of fear, but out of respect, the way a man learns to respect a live wire before he touches it. At 11, something changed. Not the sound, the air. He felt it before he understood it. A shift in the dog's breathing, from the short, defensive pant of an animal bracing for a blow, to something slower. Testing. Rowan had heard that same shift in men once, in a different kind of silence, in a different kind of dark. It was the sound of something deciding whether to keep fighting or start listening. "I'm not going to reach for you," Rowan said, voice pitched low, flat, the register he used to use for handling live ordnance and spooked recruits alike. "I'm going to reach for the gate, that's all." The volunteer beside him made a small, nervous sound. "Sir, I really don't think he's not going to hurt me." Rowan wasn't sure that was true. He said it anyway, because certainty was a tool, same as a cane, same as a countdown. You used what worked. His fingers found the latch, cold, simple mechanism, the kind that hadn't changed in 50 years. He lifted it, and the gate swung inward on a hinge that needed oil, and somewhere in that thin metal whine, the growling stopped entirely. Rowan did not step forward. He crouched instead, lowering his center of gravity, making himself smaller, slower, less like a threat and more like furniture. His cane lay across his knees. His hands rested open on the floor, palms up, an old gesture from a language older than English, older than badges, older than the war that had taken his eyes and left the rest of him standing anyway. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then he heard it, the softest scrape of claws on concrete, one paw, testing distance, the way a soldier tests a bridge that might not hold. The dog came close enough that Rowan felt warm breath against his knuckles. He did not move. He let the animal decide, because he understood something most sighted men never had to learn. Trust built in the dark was the only kind that couldn't be faked. When the dog finally allowed contact, it wasn't a nuzzle, wasn't affection. It was permission, a single, deliberate lean of the head into Rowan's open palm, as if to say, this far, no further, not yet. Rowan's fingers moved slowly up from the jaw, along the neck, and stopped when they met leather. A collar, old, cracked at the edges, buckle replaced at some point with mismatched hardware that didn't belong to the original set. His thumb traced its width and found something his ears had missed, a ridge along the underside, small and deliberate. Letters. His breath caught. He had not read Braille in years. Real Braille. The dots pressed into paper, but this was cruder, older, carved by a blade or the tip of a knife into stiff leather, worn smooth by months of a dog's own restless movement. Still, the shapes were there if a man's fingers were patient enough, and Rowan Voss had learned patience the hard way, in hospital beds, in silence, in rooms where impatience only made the dark last longer. Letter by letter, he read it the way he'd once read Terrain Under Fire carefully, and only once, because a mistake could cost everything. If you find me, someone still believes I matter. The shelter noise around him, the barking, the rattling vent, the volunteer's uneasy breathing seemed to fall away into something distant and unimportant. Rowan sat very still, his blind eyes fixed on nothing, his hand resting on the collar of a dog that had just handed him a message meant for someone else, a message written by a man who had known, somehow, that he might not live to deliver it himself. Rowan's jaw worked once, twice, before he trusted his voice enough to speak. "Who wrote this?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question, not really. It was the first step of an old, familiar posture, the one he thought he'd retired for good. The posture of a man who has just realized he is no longer looking at a stray dog. He is looking at evidence. But what the dog did next shocked everyone. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Kindness and Canine Legends. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Behind him, Dagger let out a low sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a growl, something in between. Something that, for the first time in 8 weeks, sounded less like a warning and more like grief, finally being allowed to speak. Rowan came back the next morning, and the one after that. By the fourth day, the volunteers had stopped offering to walk him to Kennel C. He knew the route by then, 11 steps from the front desk, a left turn where the floor changed from tile to sealed concrete, then the low hum of the walk-in freezer that told him he'd gone one kennel too far if he still heard it. He corrected himself without needing to ask. And something about that quiet self-sufficiency had already started to change the way the staff talked about him. Not the blind veteran anymore, just Rowan. The dog took longer to come around. Not because Dagger was slow to learn. Rowan understood within the first week that this animal had been trained by someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had built discipline into him at a level most house pets never touched. No, the delay was something else. Something Rowan recognized because he carried the same weight in his own chest. Dagger wasn't afraid of people. He was afraid of what people in a certain shape had already proven capable of. Rowan started paying attention to that shape. He noticed it on day 5, when a delivery driver came through the back hall in a navy uniform with reflective piping, and Dagger's entire body went rigid. 3 kennels away, no growl, no bark. Just a stillness, so total it was its own kind of scream. Rowan noticed it again on day 7, when Elena Cruz stopped by in street clothes on her day off, and Dagger barely lifted his head. It wasn't the person, it was the cloth. The stiffness of it, the particular way certain fabrics moved, the metallic clink of a badge or a duty belt shifting against a hip. Dagger couldn't see Rowan's old jacket patch any better than Rowan could see the dog's eyes, but the dog could smell it, could hear the specific absence of that fabric's rustle whenever Rowan moved, and somewhere in that absence, trust had begun, slowly, to take root. "You don't sound like them," Rowan said to him one afternoon, sitting on the concrete just outside the open kennel gate, close enough now that Dagger had taken to resting his chin near Rowan's boot without flinching. "You don't smell like them either. That's why you let me in." It wasn't sentiment. Rowan didn't traffic much in sentiment anymore. It was observation, offered the way he might once have briefed a room of junior Marines plainly, without decoration, because the plain truth had always struck him as more respectful than comfort, dressed up to look like something else. His hand found the familiar ridge of the collar again, tracing old ground now, the carved letters worn smoother each day under his thumb. But this time, as his fingers moved past the buckle to the underside of the leather, where it pressed against fur, he caught something new, a smell, faint, almost gone, buried under weeks of shelter disinfectant, an unwashed coat, but distinct enough that Rowan's whole body stilled the way it used to still, in the field when something in the air didn't match the terrain. Not the greasy floral smell of pet shampoo, not motor oil from a delivery truck either. He knew that smell, sharp and thin. This was heavier, older. A specific, faintly metallic sweet odor he'd cataloged 100 times in his old life, without ever needing to name it, because everyone around him had known it by sight. Gun oil, but not new, not from a range, not from routine maintenance. This had the stale, settled weight of oil that had sat somewhere unventilated for a long time, the smell of a place, not a person. Rowan sat with that thought for a long moment, his hand still resting on the dog's neck, his blind eyes fixed on the middle distance the way they always were, seeing nothing and somehow, in that particular instant, seeing everything. "Where were you?" he murmured, "before someone gave up on you?" Dagger didn't answer. Dogs never do, not in words. But he pressed his head a fraction harder into Rowan's palm, the closest thing to an answer either of them had. The shelter director had warned him it wouldn't work. "He's not a project, Mr. Voss. she'd said, not unkindly, the week before. We've had trainers try. Real trainers, with eyes. She hadn't meant it as an insult. Rowan hadn't taken it as one. He understood, better than most, how the world assumed sight was a prerequisite for competence, as though a man's hands and ears simply stopped working the moment his eyes did. He asked for a leash anyway. A short one, service grade, the kind with a solid handle instead of a loop. The director gave it to him, with the particular silence of someone waiting to be proven right. Rowan clipped it to Dagger's collar on a Tuesday morning, in the fenced yard behind the kennels, where the only sounds were wind moving through chain link and a lawnmower 2 properties over. He didn't say the dog's name. Names, in Rowan's experience, were the last thing that got through to an animal that had stopped trusting the world. Commands came first. Names were something you earned the right to use. Platz, German. Old habit, half the working dogs he'd trained overseas had come up on German commands. A strange colonial inheritance nobody bothered to explain anymore. He said it low, flat, the same tone he'd have used with a green recruit who needed to understand this wasn't a suggestion. Nothing happened for 3 full seconds. Then, the soft scrape of paws shifting weight, the controlled creak of a body lowering itself with far more precision than a frightened animal should have been capable of, and Dagger dropped into a down, elbows flat against the grass, still as a held breath. Rowan's chest tightened in a way he hadn't expected. Somewhere in this shelter dog's ruined, abandoned body was a working animal who still remembered his training, word for word, the way a soldier's hands remember a weapon strip long after his mind has tried to forget the war it was built for. Good, Rowan said, and meant it in a way that went further than the command deserved. He knelt, slowly. He'd learned by now that speed was the enemy of trust, that Dagger read velocity the way sighted men read faces, and any sudden movement undid a week of patience in half a second. His hand found the dog's shoulder first, then moved, inch by inch, along the ribs toward the left side. Dagger tensed the instant Rowan's fingers reached the old scar. It ran 4 inches along the ribs, raised and hairless. The tissue underneath pulled slightly tight, in a way that told Rowan, without needing to see it, that it had healed without proper care. Not a surgical wound, something inflicted, then neglected. Easy, Rowan murmured. He didn't pull his hand back. Pulling back would have confirmed, in the dog's mind, that there was something worth fearing here. Instead, he let his palm rest flat against the scar, unmoving, patient, the way a man learns to sit still beside something wounded and let stillness itself become the message. 10 seconds, 20. Then, for the first time since Rowan had met him, Dagger exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty out something the dog had been holding since long before the shelter, since long before the concrete kennel and the rattling vent, and let his head drop fully onto his paws. He had not simply obeyed a command. He had allowed a wound to be touched. Rowan sat with his hand there a long moment, letting the small victory settle into something real. It was the director's radio, clipped to her belt 30 feet away and crackling faintly with dispatch chatter, that broke it. The sound was ordinary, a burst of static, a code number, a woman's voice reading coordinates in the clipped rhythm every officer used. Rowan had heard 1,000 radios exactly like it without a second thought. Dagger came off the ground so fast, the leash snapped taut in Rowan's hand. Not a jump. An eruption, every muscle coiled. A rigid, silent snarl aimed at a sound rather than a person. Ears locked toward the direction of that particular radio frequency's static, with an intensity Rowan had only ever seen in animals reacting to gunfire. "Down," Rowan said again, firmer now, and after a long, trembling moment, Dagger obeyed, but his whole body stayed taut, coiled, listening. Rowan sat very still in the sudden quiet that followed, turning the moment over the way he once turned over unexploded ordnance in his mind, careful, deliberate, cataloging every angle before he let himself draw conclusions. It wasn't the uniform, it wasn't the badge, it was that exact radio frequency. "That's not fear," Rowan said quietly, mostly to himself. "That's recognition." Somewhere out past the fence, the lawnmower droned on, indifferent. Rowan's hand found the leash handle and held it a little tighter, the way he used to hold on to the only solid thing in a room that had just stopped making sense. Elena Cruz answered on the second ring. "Rowan? Everything okay?" He was sitting in his kitchen, the phone flat against the table, speaker on, because holding it to his ear for a conversation like this one felt like a formality he no longer had patience for. Outside his apartment window, a window he hadn't looked through in 3 years, though he still kept the blinds open out of some stubborn respect for the person he used to be, traffic moved in its usual indifferent rhythm. "I need you to look at a name for me," he said. "Off the record, if you can manage it." A pause on the line. Elena had known him long enough, from the support group at the VA, that neither of them attended anymore, to recognize the register in his voice. Not the tired register, the other one. Whose name? Matt Hale. The silence that followed lasted just long enough to tell Rowan everything he needed to know before she said a single word. "Where did you hear that name?" Elena said carefully. "A dog told me." It wasn't a joke, and something in his flat delivery made sure she understood that. He told her about the collar, about the carved letters worn smooth under a dog's own restless neck, about the gun oil smell buried in old fur, and a radio frequency that turned 100-pound Malinois into a coiled spring. He did not editorialize. He simply laid the facts down, the way he used to lay a map across a briefing table, and let her draw her own lines between them. When he finished, Elena exhaled slowly. He heard a chair creak she'd sat down. "Matt Hale was K9 unit," she said. 2 years ago. Good officer. Quiet. The kind of guy who remembered everyone's coffee order. A beat. He died 18 months ago. Ruled a suicide. Found in his own garage. You don't believe that. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Another silence, longer this time. And Rowan let it sit, because he understood exactly what kind of silence it was. He'd carried the same one himself, back when men in his old unit had come home from deployments they never should have survived, only to be filed away by boards and reports that preferred clean answers to true ones. "There were things that didn't add up," Elena finally said, her voice dropping. The careful cadence of someone checking a hallway before they say a name too loud. His K9 Malinois went missing from the department roster the same week, officially unfit for continued service, behavioral issues, recommended for civilian surrender, no formal evaluation on file, just gone, reassigned out of existence. She paused. Nobody signed off on where he actually went. He should have gone to a retired K9 program, not a county shelter 3 towns over. Rowan's jaw tightened, the old muscle memory of controlling his face for men who were watching him for weakness, even though there was no one in the room to see it now. "Who signed the surrender order?" he asked. "Rowan." "Who signed it, Elena?" The pause this time carried a different weight, not uncertainty, reluctance. "Lieutenant Marsh," she said quietly. He processed it personally, which is strange, because that's not his job. That's a desk sergeant's paperwork, not a lieutenant's. Rowan sat very still at his kitchen table, his hand flat against the wood, feeling the faint vibration of a delivery truck rumbling past outside. He thought of Hale's collar again, the desperate, deliberate carving of a message meant for a stranger, because the man had apparently trusted no one closer than that. Someone still believes I matter. Not someone will find me. Not someone will avenge me. Just matter. The plea of a man who suspected, correctly, that his own department might let him disappear without a second look. It struck something old and raw in Rowan's chest, a grief he'd folded up years ago and never quite finished folding. He knew what it was to serve beside someone, to trust them with your back, and then to watch the system that was supposed to protect them close ranks and move on like nothing had happened. He had buried men like that. He had delivered eulogies that left out everything true because the truth was inconvenient for people still wearing the uniform. He would not let it happen twice, not while he still had hands and ears and 100-pound reminder sleeping in his living room that some promises were worth keeping even after the man who made them was gone. "Elena," he said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that made it more dangerous, not less. "I need everything you can find on Matt Hale's last 2 weeks, quietly, and I need to know exactly where that shelter transfer paperwork came from." On the other end of the line, he heard her breathe out the sound of someone stepping, deliberately, onto ground she knew might not hold. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Give me a few days." Elena found the address 4 days later. An old distribution warehouse on the county's industrial edge, decommissioned 2 years back, flagged in exactly one line of Matt Hale's final patrol log, a line someone had tried, badly, to bury under a dozen other routine entries. She wouldn't come. Not yet. "If Marsh finds out I pulled that log," she'd said, "I lose my badge before we have anything real." Rowan understood. He didn't argue. He went alone. He took Dagger. The cab dropped them at the edge of a gravel lot half a mile out Rowan's request. Not caution so much as instinct. The old field habit of never arriving exactly where you meant to end up. He clipped the leash to Dagger's collar and let the handle settle into his palm. Familiar now, an extension of his own arm. "Find him," Rowan said. Not a command from any manual, just 3 words, offered the way you'd ask a friend for a favor you had no right to ask. Dagger's body changed instantly. The leash went taut, not frantic, focused. The dog's head dropped low, nose skimming gravel, and Rowan felt the shift travel up the leash into his own arm, a controlled, deliberate pull that had nothing in common with a house pet chasing a squirrel. This was work, old work, muscle memory older than fear. They moved. Gravel crunched, then grass, then gravel again. The wind carried diesel and rust. Rowan's cane found nothing here too uneven, too fast a pace, so he'd folded it and trusted the leash instead, trusted the dog's shoulder, brushing his knee at every turn, a silent signal. Left, now right, slow down. The ground dipped. Rowan's boot found a rut. He caught himself. Dagger didn't stop moving. 10 minutes in, the wind died. Sound changed. The open road noise behind them gave way to something closer, denser, the particular hush of a large structure blocking the sky. Rowan felt it before he heard it. A change in air pressure, a cold that came from shade, not weather. They had arrived. Dagger stopped, not slowed, stopped, every muscle locked, tail low, ears forward, the leash gone rigid as a rod in Rowan's hand. No bark, no whine, silence. Rowan crouched, found the dog's shoulder, felt it trembling, not fear trembling, not the shelter kind, something tighter, something focused. "What is it?" he murmured. No answer but the tremble. He straightened, cane back in hand now, and swept it low across the ground in front of him. Concrete, a door track, metal, half buried in dirt and dead leaves. A warehouse bay door, the kind that hadn't rolled open in years. He found a smaller door beside it, man-sized, unlocked. The hinge screamed when he pushed it. He froze. No footsteps answered. No voice. Only the hollow echo of the sound, swallowed by a space too large to be a room and too empty to be anything else. Rowan stepped inside. The air changed immediately colder, thicker, tasting faintly of rust and something underneath the rust that his mind refused, for one merciful second, to name. Dust. Old motor oil. And beneath both, so faint it might have been imagination, if Dagger's trembling hadn't confirmed it wasn't something Swedish, coppery, wrong. Dagger pulled again, harder now. Rowan let him lead, cane sweeping the floor ahead in slow, careful arcs, counting his steps out of old habit. 12, 20, 31. The leash went taut and stayed there. Dagger had stopped at a section of wall. Rowan felt it with his free hand corrugated steel, cold, seamed. Then, lower, a gap, a panel, loose, one edge pried back at some point and never properly resealed. Dagger pawed at it. Once, twice, a single sharp exhale through his nose, aimed at the gap like an accusation. Rowan knelt. His fingers found the torn edge of the panel and pulled. It gave with a shriek of old metal. Behind it, a narrow cavity, barely deep enough for a man's forearm. Rowan reached in anyway, slow, careful, the way he used to reach into spaces that might not want to be reached into. His fingers brushed dust, cobweb, then something harder, plastic, cracked along one edge. A strap, frayed. He drew it out, small, rectangular. A camera housing. The lens cracked. The mounting clip snapped clean off, the kind worn on a chest strap. A body camera. Rowan sat very still on the cold concrete floor of a warehouse no one was supposed to remember, holding in his blind hands the one piece of evidence someone had died trying to protect. Beside him, for the first time since Rowan had met him, Dagger let out a long, low sound that was not a growl at all. It was closer to a name. The camera sat heavy in his palm, heavier than its size should have allowed. Rowan did not move for a long moment. He let his other hand remain flat against the concrete, steadying himself, and made himself do the thing he had trained 100 younger Marines to do in rooms just like this one, back when his eyes still worked, and the job of reading a scene had belonged to them. Slow down. Don't conclude. Catalog. He set the camera carefully in his jacket pocket, zipped it shut, and turned his attention to the floor beneath him. His palm moved first flat, deliberate, a slow sweep across the concrete in a widening arc. Cold, colder than the air around it, the particular chill of stone that had spent a long time in permanent shade. Dust, fine and undisturbed in most places, thicker in some, thinner in others, patterns that told him people had stood here, and not recently. Then, his fingers found the stain. He knew it before his mind allowed the word to form. Not from sight. Sight had nothing to offer him here, but from texture. The concrete under his fingertips had a different quality in an irregular patch, perhaps 3 feet across. A faint roughness where something had soaked in and dried, altering the surface at a level too subtle for most hands to register. His own hands were not most hands. 3 years of reading the world through fingertips had taught him a vocabulary sighted men never bothered to learn. He did not need Elena's report to tell him what had happened here. He needed only this: the specific, dry brittleness of old blood, chemically changed from what it once was, embedded now in stone rather than resting on top of it. Not a spill, not an accident. The kind of stain that came from something happening and then no one being permitted to clean it properly, because cleaning it properly would have meant admitting it needed cleaning at all. Rowan sat back on his heels. His breath had gone shallow, and he made himself notice that, made himself slow it deliberately, the old technique from hospital beds and blacked-out rooms. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. He was not here to feel anything yet. Feeling could come later, in the dark of his own apartment, where it belonged. Beside him, Dagger had gone still, in a different way now, not the coiled tension of the doorway, but something quieter, lower. His body had folded down onto the concrete beside the stain, chin resting near its edge, in a posture Rowan recognized immediately because he had seen working dogs hold it before, in briefings, in training footage, in the field. It was not distress, it was a vigil. He's been here before, Rowan thought. He stood exactly where I'm standing. He let his hand drift to the dog's back, resting there, and Dagger did not flinch from the contact. For a moment neither of them moved. 2 creatures kneeling in the cold, beside a wound the world had tried to erase and failed. Rowan lifted his face, an old habit from sighted years, angling his head as though searching a room he could no longer search visually. He caught it, then a smell, sharper here than it had been near the entrance, cutting through the dust and the old blood and the mildew of standing water somewhere beyond the walls. Metal. Not the clean, oiled metal of a maintained weapon. Rust, the wet, corroded smell of something that had been left exposed to moisture for a long time, mingling faintly with a chemical tang he associated, from another life, with spent cartridge casings. He turned his head slowly, tracking the smell the way he'd once tracked incoming fire by sound alone, and found it strongest near a support beam 6 feet to his left. His cane, extended again now, tapped the base of the beam and found something small and solid lodged in a crack in the concrete. He knelt, fingers searching, and closed them around a shape too specific to mistake a spent shell casing, its edges dulled with rust, its presence in this exact spot, no accident of scattering. He held it in his palm beside the cracked camera housing in his pocket, and understood, with the flat, unemotional clarity of a man who had spent a career assembling terrible pictures out of small pieces, that he was no longer investigating a suicide. He was standing in the last room Matt Hale had ever stood in. Somewhere above him, wind found a gap in the warehouse roof and moaned through it, low and hollow, and Dagger's ears twitched toward the sound before settling again, unbothered. He had heard worse in this building than wind. Rowan closed his hand around the casing, and for the first time since he had lost his sight, he found himself grateful for the dark, because it meant Dagger could not see the look on his face, and did not need to. "We're leaving," Rowan said quietly, rising, cane finding the floor, hand finding the leash. "But we're coming back with people who believe us." Dagger rose without command, pressing once, briefly, against Rowan's leg, not a nudge for comfort, but something closer to agreement. They walked out the way they'd come, into wind and daylight, carrying between them the 2 smallest, heaviest pieces of a dead man's silence. Elena called him that night, and Rowan knew from the first half-second of silence on the line that something had gone wrong. "He knows," she said. "No greeting." Her voice was tight. controlled in the specific way people control their voices when they are trying very hard not to sound frightened. Marsh knows I pulled Hale's patrol log. Rowan set down the shell casing he'd been turning over between his fingers at the kitchen table, a habit now, worry beads made of evidence, and gave her his full attention. "Tell me exactly what happened. He called me into his office an hour ago. Didn't ask me anything directly. Just," she exhaled hard, "just mentioned, real casual, that IT flags unusual database queries now. Said it like small talk. Then he asked how my father's doing. My father, who works 2 counties over, Rowan, in a department Marsh has no business knowing anything about." Rowan's jaw tightened. He recognized the shape of that conversation. He had delivered versions of it himself, once, long ago, in a different uniform, to men who needed reminding that the world was larger than they thought, and their families were part of it. He hated that he recognized it. He hated more that Elena now had to carry the same particular cold that came with being reminded. "He's not guessing," Rowan said. "He's confirming, which means someone told him you asked." "I know." Her voice cracked slightly. "Just once, then steadied. I'm scared, Rowan. Not for me, for my dad." "Then we move carefully," he said. "Not slower, carefully." But after the call ended, Rowan sat alone in his kitchen for a long time, the phone dark on the table in front of him, and the careful, controlled version of himself he'd offered Elena began, quietly, to come apart. He replayed the warehouse, the stain on the concrete, the rusted casing now sitting inches from his hand. He had felt so certain there, kneeling in that cold room, cataloging evidence with his fingertips, the way he used to catalog terrain, certain in a way that had almost felt like purpose again. After 3 years of feeling like a leftover part in a machine that had moved on without him. Now, alone, the certainty curdled into something else. What if you're wrong? The thought arrived uninvited, in his own voice, flat and merciless. What if you felt a stain that was just old machine oil? What if the casing was left by hunters, kids, anyone? What if you built a conspiracy out of texture and smell, because texture and smell are all you have left to build anything out of, and you needed this to be real? He pressed his palms flat against the table, an old grounding technique, and found no ground in it tonight. He thought of Elena's voice cracking on the phone, a young officer he had personally pulled into danger, based on evidence a blind man had assembled entirely by touch. He thought of her father, a stranger to Rowan, now a name in Marsh's mouth because of a chain of events that traced back to Rowan's hands on a dog collar in a shelter 3 weeks ago. You can't see a face across a room anymore. You can't read a badge number. You can't even be certain the man across from you is smiling or reaching for a weapon, and you've convinced a good officer to risk her family on your word. The old guilt rose with it, familiar and bottomless, not new, never new, only ever waiting. The guilt of a man who had walked away from an explosion that had taken his sight and left 3 better men behind in the dirt. The guilt that asked, every single day since, in a voice indistinguishable from his own, "Why you? Why did you get to keep breathing, when men with more to offer the world did not?" He had told himself, in the shelter, in the warehouse, that this was different, that finding Hale's truth was a way of finally being useful again, of turning 3 years of uselessness into something that mattered. Now, in the dark of his kitchen, he wondered if he had simply mistaken desperation for certainty. If a blind man chasing a dead man's ghost, dragging a frightened young officer along with him, was courage, or just one more way of getting someone else hurt, because he could no longer trust his own judgment of the world. Across the room, he heard daggers shift on the rug by the door. the soft click of nails against hardwood, and then the weight of the dog settling closer, near enough that Rowan felt warmth against his leg. He reached down without thinking and found the collar, the old carved letters worn smooth under his thumb now, more familiar to him than his own reflection had ever been. Someone still believes I matter. Rowan sat with his hand on the collar for a long time, saying nothing, and did not know, in that moment, whether the words belonged to Hale or to Dagger, or, quietly, unbearably, to himself. The call came at 9:40 the next night. It was the shelter director, her voice pitched too high, too fast. "Rowan, there's a man here. Says he's animal control. County authorization. Some kind of emergency behavioral seizure order for Dagger. I've never seen paperwork like this. He wants to take him tonight." Rowan was already reaching for his jacket before she finished the sentence. "Don't let him leave with the dog," Rowan said. "I'm 12 minutes out." Stall him. How do I? Ask questions. Slowly. Read every line of the paperwork out loud if you have to. 12 minutes. He hung up and moved, cane in hand, counting his own front steps out of pure reflex. The earlier doubt from the night before, folding itself away into some back drawer of his mind, because there was no room for it now. Whatever he was or wasn't certain of, one thing had stopped being a question the moment the director said tonight. Somebody wanted Dagger gone before Dagger could ever be asked, formally, what he already knew. The cab ride felt endless. Rowan spent it running his thumb along the worn collar leather he still carried folded in his jacket pocket. He'd asked the director to keep the real one on the dog, decoy or not, because removing it now would only confirm to anyone watching that it mattered. He arrived to raised voices in the shelter's front lot. Rowan didn't rush the door. He stood a moment on the gravel, breathing slow, cataloging sound, the way he always did. 2 voices, the director's clipped and stalling, and a second, male, flat, professionally patient, in the specific way of someone used to being obeyed, without needing to raise his voice. Rowan stepped inside. "Evening," he said, pitching his voice loud enough to fill the room, calm enough to sound like he had nowhere else to be. "I hear there's some paperwork trouble." "Sir, this doesn't concern you," the man said. Rowan placed him by voice alone, early 40s, flat Midwestern vowels, the particular clipped cadence of someone with law enforcement training, even in casual speech. "Not Marsh, someone sent by Marsh. It concerns me," Rowan said, "because that's my dog's file you're holding, and I signed the foster custody transfer 2 weeks ago." A lie, offered without a flicker of hesitation, the same flat delivery he used to give false radio traffic, to confuse enemy listeners a lifetime ago. "And director, do you have my paperwork handy?" The director, to her credit, caught the rhythm instantly. Yes, let me just find it. It's in the back file. Give me a moment." "You don't need his paperwork," the man said, an edge entering now. "I have county authorization for immediate seizure, behavioral risk. This isn't a discussion." Rowan let a beat of silence sit before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had dropped, gone slower, heavier, the register he used to use for men who thought they held every card in the room. "Funny thing about being blind," he said, "you learn to hear things sighted men miss, like the fact that your county authorization form doesn't have a case number stamped on the top corner. Real emergency seizure orders always do. I know, because I spent 4 years reading intake reports before I lost my eyes. So why don't you tell me who actually sent you?" The silence that followed had teeth in it. "Step back from the kennel," the man said, quieter now, no longer patient. Rowan didn't move. He let his cane drift, slow and deliberate, until its tip rested against the base of Dagger's kennel gate, behind him, not blocking anything a sighted man would call an obstacle, but positioning himself precisely between the man's voice and the sound of Dagger's low, building growl. "You're welcome to walk past me," Rowan said. "I won't stop you. I'm blind, remember. I couldn't see you coming even if I tried." It was not a threat. It was an invitation, offered in the same flat tone as everything else. And it worked exactly the way Rowan intended, because men who relied on intimidation rarely knew what to do with someone who simply refused to be intimidated back. The man hesitated. Rowan heard it, the almost imperceptible shift of weight off the front foot, the tell of someone recalculating. Behind Rowan, Dagger's growl deepened, low and continuous now, no longer a warning issued once, but a wall being built in real time, and the man's breathing changed audibly, the particular catch of someone remembering, suddenly, that the animal in front of him weighed nearly as much as he did, and had every reason in the world not to be reasonable tonight. "This isn't over," the man finally said. "No," Rowan agreed quietly, "it isn't." Footsteps retreated across gravel. An engine started, too fast, tires spitting loose stone as the vehicle pulled away into the dark. Rowan exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes, and behind him, Dagger's growl finally eased into something closer to a long, unsteady breath, two creatures standing guard over the same fragile, dangerous truth, neither one willing, tonight, to let it be taken. The press conference had been scheduled for weeks, a routine quarterly briefing, county crime statistics, the kind of event most reporters attended out of obligation rather than interest. Elena had confirmed that morning that Marsh would be standing at the podium himself, presenting the department's community safety initiatives to a half-full room of local press. She had also confirmed something else. A forensic tech she trusted, off the books, had pulled what remained of the footage from the cracked camera. Water damage had taken most of it, not all. "It's enough," she'd told Rowan the night before, her voice steadier than it had been in days. "It's enough to matter." Rowan stood now at the back of the briefing room, Dagger seated calm and alert at his side, the dog's service harness donated that morning by a canine handler Elena trusted. A small act of ceremony Rowan hadn't asked for, but hadn't refused, either lending them both a legitimacy no one in the room had been prepared to see walk through the door. He heard Marsh's voice from the podium, confident, practiced, moving through statistics no one in the room would remember by lunch. Rowan waited. He had learned patience from men far more dangerous than a lieutenant with something to hide, and he intended to spend every ounce of it correctly today. Elena's voice cut through the routine murmur of the room. "Lieutenant, before we move to questions, there's something the department needs to address regarding Officer Matthew Hale." The room's temperature changed. Rowan felt it the way he felt weather now, in pressure and pause, rather than light the particular hush of reporters sensing, all at once, that the scheduled story had just stopped being the story. "That matter is closed," Marsh said. Rowan heard the practiced calm hold for exactly one sentence too long. "Ruled a suicide by the county coroner 18 months ago." "With respect, sir," Elena said, and Rowan heard her step forward. "New evidence has come to light. A tech near the front, the one Elena had briefed, activated the room's projector. Rowan couldn't see it. He didn't need to. He heard it instead, the recovered audio filling a suddenly silent room, broken, static-laced, water-damaged past any hope of visual clarity, but not past hope entirely. A man's voice, tired, urgent, speaking low into a chest-mounted mic in what sounded like a warehouse, the acoustics unmistakable to ears that had stood in that exact room 3 weeks earlier. If anyone finds this Marsh knows about the transfer. He's been running product through the depot since March. I've got dates, I've got... Static swallowed the rest. Then, fainter, almost lost. If something happens to me, look after the dog. He knows more than anybody's giving him credit for. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. Rowan counted them, the way he counted everything, before the room erupted into overlapping questions, shouted names, the scrape of chairs. Rowan stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that the quietest voice in a chaotic room was often the one people strained hardest to hear. "That dog is standing right here," he said, and the room gradually listened. "His name is Dagger. He was surrendered under falsified behavioral paperwork, the same week Officer Hale died paperwork. This department has never explained. He carries a scar consistent with abuse. He carries a collar with a message carved into it by a man who apparently didn't trust his own department to protect him." Rowan paused, letting his blind eyes settle, unseeing, somewhere in the direction of the podium. "I'd like someone to explain why." Every head in the room turned to Marsh. Rowan couldn't see his face. He didn't need to. He heard it instead, the silence, stretching a half-second too long, the shift of weight from one foot to the other, the small, involuntary catch of breath that every interrogator learns to listen for, the sound of a man calculating an exit that no longer existed. This is Marsh started and stopped, started again. "I was not involved in Marshia." A reporter's voice cut across him, sharp. "Lieutenant, are you denying you signed Officer Hale's K-9 surrender order personally?" The silence that followed was its own answer. Rowan stood very still amid the rising noise, Dagger steady and unmoving at his side, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight since the moment he'd first read a dead man's message under his fingertips in a cold kennel 3 weeks ago. It wasn't triumph. It was quieter than that, the particular, hard-won relief of a promise, finally, being kept. Beside him, Dagger let out a long breath through his nose, and, for the first time since Rowan had known him, allowed his ears to fall fully relaxed, no longer listening for a threat that, at last, had nowhere left to hide. Marsh was suspended within the week. The county reopened Hale's case within 2. Elena told him, over the phone, that the internal affairs file was thick enough now that no amount of quiet influence would close it again, the kind of thickness that came from truth, once it started moving, refusing to be talked back into silence. Rowan waited until the department's part was finished before he did the part that belonged only to him. He found Hale's mother's address through Elena, an old woman living alone 2 counties north, in a small house that smelled, when the door opened, of cedar and old coffee. Rowan introduced himself plainly a veteran, a volunteer, someone who had come to know her son's dog. She was quiet for a long moment after he explained why he'd come. He heard her breath catch once, carefully controlled. The particular sound of someone who had spent 18 months being told a story about her son that she'd never quite believed. "He always did talk to that dog like it understood him," she finally said, her voice thick. "I used to tell him, Matthew, it's a dog, not a priest." A small, broken laugh. He'd just say, "Ma, he understands more than most people I work with." Rowan reached into his jacket and drew out the collar. The real one, cracked leather, carved letters, worn nearly smooth now, under 3 sets of hands that had needed, each in their own way, to believe someone still mattered. He held it out and felt her take it from him with both hands, carefully, the way people hold things that have become, without warning, sacred. He wanted you to have this, Rowan said. It wasn't precisely true, not in the way facts are usually true. But Rowan had learned, across a long and complicated life, that some truths lived beneath the facts rather than inside them, and this was one of them. Matt Hale had trusted his message to a dog because he'd run out of people he trusted enough to carry it directly. Rowan was simply finishing the delivery. The old woman held the collar to her chest and wept, quietly, without apology, and Rowan sat with her in that small kitchen that smelled of cedar and coffee, and said nothing at all, because some grief only asked to be witnessed, not answered. That evening, Rowan sat in his apartment with the lamp on beside him, out of habit rather than need, the old warm bulb doing nothing for his eyes, and everything for the small, human ritual of light in a room after dark. Dagger lay stretched across the sofa cushions, a habit Rowan had given up correcting weeks ago, some battles not worth the winning, his breathing slow and even, one paw twitching faintly now and then in a dream Rowan would never know the shape of, though he liked to imagine, in his better moments, that it was a good one. Rowan let his hand rest on the dog's flank, feeling the rise and fall of it, steady as a tide that had finally found its shore. He thought of Hale's collar, carved by a man who understood, in his last frightened days, that loyalty was the only currency he had left to spend, and had spent it on a dog rather than a system that had already begun failing him. He thought of Dagger's scar and the radio static that had once turned muscle into iron, and the long, patient unlearning of fear that neither of them could have managed alone. Rowan had spent 3 years believing that losing his sight had made him less useful to the world, a soldier with no war left to fight, a protector with nothing left worth protecting. He understood now, sitting in the quiet with a sleeping dog's heartbeat under his palm, that he had simply been waiting for the world to hand him a different kind of vigilance, one built not on eyes, but on the willingness to keep listening long after everyone else had decided a story was finished. Loyalty, he thought, was never really about keeping watch for danger. It was about refusing to let the people, and the ones who loved without words, disappear quietly, simply because the world found their silence convenient. Outside, the city moved on the way cities always did, indifferent and unbroken. Inside, in a small room lit more by habit than by need, a broken soldier and a broken dog had, at last, stopped waiting to be found, because they had already found each other, and that, it turned out, had been enough all along.